Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for getting up because I know you're in Austin, Texas, and you probably had a good evening last night, and I bet some of you stayed up fairly late, but so we're glad you're here. This is the second day of South by Southwest at ACC, and as already been mentioned, the Collaboratorium is a brand new space, and we would like to say thank you to the state of Texas for making this possible. This was a partnership that we received $5 million from the governor's fund and we matched it with more, but to make this space available to work with what we've got going on in Austin with Army Futures Command and the software factory. So one of the things I think you already know is that Austin is a center for gravity in innovation. And I heard that mentioned last night, so that's not original with me. Someone mentioned that at a dinner that I was at, and I thought, you know, that's really good to remember that. And if we go back and think a little bit about yesterday's events, I don't know how many of you were here, but we had a big announcement here that the Marine Corps is coming to join ACC as well as the Army, and we love that. And I'll put the invitation out there for Navy, Air Force, even Coast Guard, anybody else. We'd love to have y'all all come. So thank you. And what we do have going on here that we're really proud of is this great partnership with the Army, and partnerships matter. So we want to grow that. And the other thing that we are pretty sure about, there's not another innovative center the same as this all over the country where they've partnered with a public community college and with the military, and we continue to grow. And in fact, had the opportunity to be on a panel last year and talk about this, and we had community colleges from all over the country, and it was a military event, had people coming up and saying, how did you do that? And we've had calls and people coming to look. Because you've got a community college no matter where you are in the nation. And they tend to be more nimble than universities, and I love universities and I'm a hook 'em horns, but it's the community colleges that can really move and do the things that can be quite helpful as we all work together. So collaboratively, under first General Murray's leadership and now under General Rainey's leadership, we're continuing to grow this partnership and love what we're doing. This is the only place, like I said, that I know where you've got a collaboration between city, state, and the federal government and the colleges, and it's going to keep going. One of the things we say here is innovation plus collaboration equals transformation. And that's what's happening here. It's not rhetoric, because we can all talk about it, but is it the reality and we do it? And we do that here. And my other thing I like to tell people, we're not your grandmother's community college. We're very different from what people used to think about in a community college. So let's get started with this panel, and there'll be time for questions at the end. I want to tell you just a little bit more about each one of our panel members. First is Mr. Young Bang. He is the Principal Deputy Assistant of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology. He's a West Point graduate, a wildly successful technologist as well, and a committed mentor to soldiers in STEM fields across the Army, which is so critical that we have great people that come back and serve as mentors. So thank you for serving our country and for that. Mr. Bang has certainly seen the power of software both in the public and in the private sectors. Then next to him, we have Mr. Abdul Subhani, who's the CEO of Syntex Technologies, and he also serves the United States Army in a variety of capacities that include civilian aid to the Secretary of the Army right here in this Central Texas area where he lives, and he's also the Distinguished Innovation Chair at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He is also a committed mentor and supporter of the Boys and Girls Club, and he's the chair-elect of our ACC Foundation Board here. Thank you so much for all you do. And then last, but certainly not least, we've got a wonderful woman who is a retired Army officer and notable TechSec leader. And she joins us today as the lead for all public sector sales for VMware. She's served in a variety of positions for companies across the private sector, and I know also is a great mentor for women and a great role model. So please welcome all of these people. And thanks to each one of you for joining us for the first panel of the second day of South by Southwest at ACC. I'm going to ask some questions, and I'm not going to direct any of them to any person. Each of you feel free to answer then the next, and you don't have to answer, but I think you all bring so much expertise to this. I don't want to short anybody by saying just one person answer. So we're going to begin with this one. I'm an educator, and it's been interesting for me to see how software has changed how we approach both running an institution and educating our students. And I'm old enough, I can go back when we didn't even have computers, and then you think about how quickly everything is changing today. So I am going to ask each of you if you would speak to the impact software has in your respective sectors and what you see for the future in the short term and the long term. And I'll just start with you.
Yeah, thank you, Mary Beth. So I think that's a critical, important area that we really think about. I think what you have done, what Abdul has done, what AFC has done here in Austin is incredible, right? So I always talk about we need more of a digitally literate workforce in the Army, in the DoD, in the federal sector. And a lot of our leaders are really great at their functional areas, whether it's war fighting in the Army or whether it's tax in the IRS. But really at the end of the day, everybody grew up these days on the phone. The kids these days, when my kids were 5, they were programming in Scratch. That's just kind of the nature of how people are. And like you said, I grew up in the times when we had the first Apples, a little, you know. But we evolved and understood that from our sector because, you know, I was a tech person. But a lot of the people in the Army or in the military grew up doing certain things, war fighting in their functional areas, and helping to educate them around technology is critical. And we don't need all the generals to be coders. That's not what I mean. I want them to be digitally literate so they understand the concepts. And more importantly than understanding just the concepts of the technology is then how do we actually use the technology to employ it to our missions? And I think that's the intent of when we talk about digital literacy to our leaders, that's where we're getting at. Now, having said that, we have a wealth of soldiers who literally grew up in the digital age, and we have to embrace that. We have to allow for that. They will become our future leaders, so the nature of the Army of 2030 and the Army of 2040 will shift and evolve as our young soldiers and officers become the leaders. And so it's really a big transitional point for the Army, for the government, and efforts like what AFC is doing down here in Austin are great enablers of that because we want to train, retrain, upskill, and more importantly, retain the talent that we have in the Army. And I think this is a great mechanism to do that. And then we also, as we do that here with AFC, we want to make sure that our soldiers have a future home to go to in the Army, doing the things that they love, right? And so I've been here multiple times, software factory, and soldiers like, oh, this is great, but I don't want to go back to being a gate guard. And so we have an institution have to enable that so they have a career progression in the Army, doing those type of things that they want to do. And that's what we're trying to do at the Army level, at the institutional level, to say, what is the future path for these type of soldiers? And it does take time because we're not going to be able to create new branches overnight or whatever, but we are trying to track the skills that people have, right? Whether it's through Software Factory or AFC, or whether they're working already from the commercial side. A lot of them are reservists and National Guards. How do we identify that talent? As well as people that are already doing this in the Army, right? We have tons of labs that are actually doing lots of research, software, data, all those type of things, and then our PEOs do the same thing. So there already is future homes for them as well as people on the cyber side. We just have to mobilize that better and create a journey map, right, for the soldiers so they know that their careers, they can progress like that, doing that in the Army, or they can go back to being gate guard. That's okay too. And we want to allow them to go back and forth, right? So the notion of being single-threaded, I think, applies to functional skills and technology skills, and we have to allow for that. It's just going to take us a little bit at a time.
Great, thanks. I love that journey map. Give them a path. Abdul?
Thank you, ma'am. So I think I will echo everything what Mr. Banks said, but I want you all to understand that it's also the same thing, a similar transformation happening in the in the commercial world as well. So even as defense contractors who are trying to go and work with DoD, they are also having a similar challenges of digital literacy for their employees and so forth as well. And understanding that aspect of what I love about what AFC and Army Software Factory is doing is creating that buzz within the DoD. And what we are doing today here and yesterday, having those conversations, sometimes hard conversations, to try to understand that this is doable. This is not something which we can just have a conversation and discussion on the panels, but actually we are doing it. And of course, having Marines joining us now as well here, that will be really, really good because now the other branches will be seeing this as well. And what Mr. Bang and his background, as you mentioned, will be it's a great asset for everybody to see in Army leadership. I think needs to realize that we need to make the changes, especially nowadays as we are having a recruitment concerns and so forth all over the military as well. And having in 2023, we need to have these hard conversations, how we can make that change.
Great. Jennifer.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so what I see, is very much aligned with both of your comments. So my team works with customers across the public sector every day. So not only do we work with federal government customers, but we also work with state, local, and education across the United States. And for all of them, the focus is really about digital innovation, digital transformation, and how to leverage software and cloud and AI on their technology modernization path. And so I think what we see here at Austin, or Army Futures Command and AFC, is a great example of how to leverage all of those technologies specifically for mission outcomes. So it's really, about not only digital modernization and digital transformation for innovation's sake, but also for delivering outcomes, which is a great example here, of what's being done for soldiers each and every day. So we're really excited about the work we do here and really excited that the Marines are joining, and hopefully we'll get the rest of the services to join as well. So it's exciting, and we're very pleased to support it all.
Thanks. This kind of goes on top of what we were just talking about. All of y'all have something in common, and I think you really did, Jennifer, just talk about it a lot. You've worked for the Army in some capacity, but you've also been in the private sector at some point in your lives. And what are your takeaways from that unique perspective of having both worked with the Army and worked publicly? And I'm going to keep it with you, Jennifer, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, I think, the thing that stood out for me the first time that I visited the Army Software Factory here was just as I said, the impact on the mission, and seeing things. I was in the Army from 1989 to, 20-some years. I think I retired in 2011. But just seeing the applications that they were working on here were the same things that I was struggling with when I was in the Army, right? So it's just really, really exciting to see where we are now. And the ability and the impact that software and modern technology has on what soldiers do in the field each and every day. I mean, that's the most exciting thing for me is being able to look back on my Army career and say, wow, those things that I struggled with as a young lieutenant or a young captain in company command are things that this team here is working to solve each and every day. And it's really, really impactful.
I would say the main difference between the commercial and the DoD sector will be decision makers. We, in the commercial side, can make the decisions very quickly, relatively quickly. Might be very quickly, might not be a good. So I think that is one major concern on that, and how we procure the stuff. That can be services or that can be a product. Having that time, which can take sometimes in the DoD sector, government sector, can be relatively longer, and Mr. Bank can go into detail on that probably.
Yeah, That's a great question, Mary Beth. I was just thinking about it as the other panelists, and I'm stalling here for talking. But really, at the end of the day, I look at having been in the Army, went to the public sector for a long time, coming back. There's a lot of things that have changed, but there's a lot of things that haven't. And when you think about that the underlying reason is because of the culture. Culture on the private sector and culture on the DoD and the Army sector are vastly different. And I think that, you know, when I talk about things, I'm not a binary this or that person. I think it's something in the middle, and we have to really meet each other in the middle. And so there's a lot of things, whether it's software, we always talk about, hey, re-leverage or reuse, right? And there's people in the culture, even on the development side, well, I can do this better. I'm just going to do it myself, right? And so, again, neither are the exact right scenarios. It's a little bit of both. And I think the Army, we have to do better at adopting a lot of the lessons learned that commercial has already made, right? And that way we can catch up faster. And we shouldn't think that our mission is so unique that we can't adopt certain things. Well, we can, but that is correct. There are certain missions that are very unique to us. And so while I think we can make a lot of strides to adopt and re-leverage a lot of what commercials had, and that way we can kind of catch up to concepts and modern software development, which we're trying to push. But there are other dimensions that we can't just necessarily take everything out of the box or the playbook and adopt that, you know, kit and caboodle. And so again, I think it's got to be a little bit of both. The Army and the DoD kind of meeting commercial best practice in the middle, commercial best practice meeting the Army and the DoD in the middle, and that way I think we can actually accelerate the rate of change, evolve the culture, because we're not going to change the culture overnight, but evolve the culture. That's going to take a little bit of time. So I think if the Army, our soldiers, our people can be a little more patient, we are trying to knock down these big obstacles at the enterprise level so we can actually evolve the culture, but it does take a little bit of time.
And I'm glad you brought up culture, and I probably won't quote this quote exactly right, but I know when I was getting my doctorate, and it's of course in higher ed, we've got the same issues. All public sectors, I think, have these issues, but culture, I know I had a professor that used to say something like, culture eats strategy for breakfast every day, and it will win out if you're not careful. So it is certainly something, I'm glad you brought it up, that we all have to work on in that regard. And I think, I'm going to skip down to a question I had further, but I think it fits in here because when we talk about culture, I think we're also looking at diversity and why that's so important. And I think if you look at this panel today, I think it's great. It's very diverse, but as we talk about bringing diversity into the tech sector, and I know that's been hard even for us at ACC, when we have IT programs, we have a lot more interest in people going into nursing because they're familiar with it than they are IT. So how can we continue to improve the diversity of the people serving or coming into tech-minded roles in the public sector? I'm going to start with you, Abdul, on that one.
I think it is one of those things that we cannot just push diversity just to say that we have diversity on it. As I've been visiting West Point for the last year or so, and trying to understand the culture there and all those conversations we are having. The diversity is one of those things, and especially in the tech sector, we are trying to find out what diverse minds, what exactly they are, the educating part of that, and that needs to be done in a very early age, and not just in high school in 11th grade and 12th grade, needs to be taught in middle schools and so forth as we are trying to explain what technology aspects that they can go through. Used to be about 15 years ago and so forth, people say he's an IT person. But now there are so many other things that they can do, from auditing to cybersecurity to, there's 14 different things in the software development side. So pinpointing a student to say that, hey, he or she will be wanting to become a software developer, also sometimes which language, which platforms and so forth, other things that comes to it. So I think the diversity is one of those hard questions that leaders like ourselves and others needs to realize that it needs to be understandable for the cultural side of it, what Mr. Bang mentioned as well. If there's a culture in the organization, that can be a community college or university or a company, that will, I think, flourish itself.
I think, so I used to come to Austin a lot, besides South by in my previous lives, and you know the motto everyone's got here in Austin, keep Austin weird. That's, in my mind, what we all have to do better on. Whether it's the private sector, whether it's the Army or the federal sector, when you look at diversity across the board, we have to allow for differences. And the Army does this as well, right? And so does the commercial sector. There's a certain mold that people expect leaders to be on the commercial side. Oh, and I lived this my whole life. Oh, young, smart, he's a tech person, let him do that. But we're never going to consider them for a leadership role, right? But if you look at the workforce from a diversity perspective, on the IT side, on the software side, most of the staff are actually diverse, but it's not represented at the leadership level, right? And so we have to do a better job across the board as people, as leaders, one, to break that ceiling, but two, to allow for people to have different paths. How I got to be, you know, where I was on the commercial side, very different path than your typical leader that went straight to a P&L from a management perspective for Harvard Business School or whatever. But we do have to allow for that, and I think allowing that weirdness, Austin, AKA Austin, the diversity, that allows for that, and then leaders have to recognize that just because I don't look like you, that doesn't mean you can't be a leader. We have to do that better, and then flip that back onto the Army side. Army's struggling with that too. Software developers, people on the tech side like me, don't look like the rest of the people in the formations, right? We have some lessons learned from our signal community, from our cyber community, which is great because now they've become formations. That will take a little bit of time. But too often we think that to be a general officer, you have to have your company command, your battalion command, your brigade command, right? Your division command and all those type of things. We have to allow for diversity in their career paths. We have to allow for diversity in thought leaders. But more importantly, we have to allow diversity at the leadership level that reflects more of the interest, more of the experiences that our soldiers have. And again, I think we just have to do better, and we have to strive to be better that way to allow for that diversity.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is one thing we do in VMware really well, I believe, is we actually measure diversity, right? And so, you know, every time I have to report out on my business to my boss, the very first slide I use quarterly is what does my team look like? What percentage of women do I have? What percentage of you know, underrepresented minorities? What is the attrition rate in my team? And I require my team to do that as well. So I think you know, we can talk about it a lot, but until you really start measuring it and seeing the impact in your organization, you can't really take much action. The other thing we do in VMware is our corporate bonus every year. One of the key metrics that we determine the payout of that bonus is on our diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. And so I think we have really done a good job. This is the first company that I've been in that has really put our money where our mouth is in terms of measuring diversity and continuing to drive leaders at all levels to really look hard at the makeup of their team. And that's across sales, marketing, you know, engineering development across the company. So I'd love to see other tech companies do that. I'm sure they all have initiatives, but I think that's a really, really positive one that we do.
Great, thanks. Delivering software outcomes in the public sector is tough for a lot of reasons. And the DoD is one of the world's largest organizations, has a very unique mission. I think it's certainly probably one of the most important missions that we have, protecting our national security. Not anything more important than that. But also we know that the world is changing, and we've already hit on this a lot. It's changed quite rapidly from being kinetic focused. We're doing the bullets and the bombs to an equal focus on digital solutions, including AI and software. What are the types of ways we could improve software outcomes in the DoD, both big and small? Whoever wants to go with that one, y'all are all looking at me like.
What was the last part?
What are the types of ways we could improve software outcomes in the DoD, both big and small. What are ways that we could do something? We're talking about public.
I think me and Mr. Bang was talking yesterday actually with CDAO also in the room about requirements. Having the requirements. We were talking about how the software is getting built 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and in DoD market right now also we are pretty much utilizing the same things that we've been doing in 15 years ago or so, and how we can make it more agile, and what we are doing here in Software Factory. So I think there needs to be more of governance part of it, and as I know, Mr. Bang is working on those aspects as well. But if you're talking about DoD itself, that needs to come from the top as well. I think. But sometimes a lot of governance is also, I have seen at least in the last 2.5, 3 years being involved in this, can be also not letting do the fun part for the developers and so forth as well. So it needs to be balanced. And I know there's some of the initiatives Mr. Bang is doing in the Army that he can explain.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking yesterday, and I was using the analogy of a Scrum Master, right? What's a good Scrum Master? Yes, you want them to be technical. Yes, you want them to be a development background. But really the role of a Scrum Master is to identify those obstacles and just knock them down so your teams can actually start doing everything that they need to do, right? And so I use that analog all the time. I say I'm the biggest Scrum Master in the Army. I'm going to identify with everybody here, what are those institutional obstacles that are preventing us to get to Agile, preventing us to get to DevSecOps? And my role is to just knock those down. It's going to take a little bit of time because there's an Army, it's got the Army's institutional processes, and some of those have to change, but there's some obstacles there that I'm really trying to look at. One of them are the requirements. And the way from the Army, like Abdul was alluded to, we've been doing requirements for decades the same way. And it's the same waterfall approach. So even if we move to development, software development in an agile approach, if our requirements was developed, thick piece of paper that thick of requirements, that drives everything else to the testing, to the processes, the end-to-end. We might be developing increments, but we can't actually even test it because the requirements were written a certain way that we got to wait for everything else to be done to even test it, right? So we're trying to address those type of things in the beginning. We are pretty insistent and adamant that we want units, operational units, to come in to work with our colleagues that are working on the requirements in the AFC and the TRADOC side. So we're really trying to drive ForceCom into the process here because they have to represent the users to get it to smaller, bite-sized pieces of small R requirements so we can actually develop in an agile fashion, so we can actually develop incrementally and deploy incrementally, so we can actually, more than just agile, we want to get to DevSecOps, and there's things that are really institutionally we have to work on. The next part we're going to tackle is the testing, the CATO and the AIC portions that really makes the life cycle a lot longer. And so we were talking about this yesterday. Acquisition is this big, right? ASALT owns this part, the development, integration, the purchasing, whatever. We got to fix the other portions of the Army's institutional acquisition process, right? So we can actually get to DevSecOps and CI/CD. And so those are the things that we're trying to work on. That's at a macro level. At a micro level, I think we got to keep working with people that are doing software development so we can top down, bottom up. We have to revolutionize, and we all have to be messengers, right, and evangelists about this, and coalition of willing, right, band together, but we have to be messengers to kind of tell the gospel so we can inform and educate other people. So when I'm trying to knock out these obstacles, y'all are part of the group that really are helping me mobilize the rest of the community to do that.
I think I would just reinforce a couple of points. One is the agility not only in the software processes, but also in acquisition. So one of the things that we struggle with a lot in my organization is just how to help our customers actually acquire modern technology and software, specifically when we are delivering it as software as a service. So I think another area that would sort of improve the DoD's ability to adopt modern technologies is, agility in the accreditation process as well. So we find that a lot of times we have products that we can deliver to a commercial customer tomorrow, but it can take us up to 12 months to get it to our ability to deliver to a DoD customer, simply because the accreditation is so lengthy. So I think that's something. I know that the federal government and DoD are working to improve, but there's a lot more that we could be doing there.
Yeah, if I could jump on that. I mean,
Please.
so there are a lot of things that we are trying to do in the Army. We're setting out 4 Pathfinder projects this year right now to really get at the long portion of the acquisition pieces that we talked about. We've identified some of these, and we are, on that side, working with the G6. We are working with our cyber to try to get the accreditation portions. We're also working with the Army CIO to see if we could get some of those authorities delegated, right, like CATO, from the DoD CIO. Right now, DoD CIO has delegated that, I think, just to DISA. They haven't delegated that to the Army or any of the other services yet, but I think that's where all the services, Navy, Air Force, if we could all kind of work together to get with the DoD CIO to get that delegation so we can get to CATO is going to be really helpful for you from industry.
Absolutely.
But again, those are some of the things that, again, people think, oh, acquisition. Well, we don't actually control that,
Yeah.
right? But we are trying to work together to do that. And again, we hear all the industry's feedback, and we are trying to address some of these. This will be one of the pilots there that we can start fleshing out the process, because we can't say, I'll delegate this to us, but we don't have a process yet for it.
Right, yep.
And so that's why we're trying to flesh out these processes. But we're trying to do that so industry can help us faster get to where we need to be.
It's a difficult thing because you have to be secure, but you can't let the speed of the mission, sort of die on the vine because of the need to drive security. So there's a balance there that I know is difficult.
Okay, great. So the private sector, and again, all of y'all are in that now, but the private sector does, I think, often claim that they're better in software development than the public can do it. And is that possibly an assumption rather than a reality? And talk to me about that.
So the question is the private sector better at?
Often, if you're just out in the public and talking to people, you're going to hear that. And one of the things I always think about, so many of the people in the public sector came from the private sector.
Yeah.
And if that, or I mean, everybody, I'm sorry, I said that opposite the way I should have. So many in the private sector came from the public sector and got a lot of their training. But we also know that we lose a lot of people from the public sector to the private because of dollars. So, so what I was saying is, talk to me about the assumption that we're always better in the private than we are in the public. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I can start.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I think, I don't think you're necessarily trying to be provocative.
No.
Which I think is okay, though. We should probably be talking about it, right? But at the end of the day, I think there's a lot of things that the industry is better at. I don't know that necessarily coding is, right? Because like I said before, we have libraries of software, and how many people reuse them? A lot of them people should, but a lot of people will redevelop stuff, right? So arguably it's saying, do you have smarter people than we do? I don't know. People go back and forth. But what I will say that the industry is better at is product development, product ownership, right? Scalability, right? Of those type of things, right? So we might actually have amazing scientists, which we do, developing incredibly sophisticated algorithms, and I actually need someone really super smart on math to validate some of these things sometimes. And we have some incredibly talented soldiers developing some software code, right? And so it's components that I think we do extremely well. And just like any organization, in any type of corporate company, there's probably pockets that excel more than others. But what industry does extremely well is taking that, scaling it, hardening it, productizing it, right, sustaining it, patching, all of that as a life cycle. They do that incredibly well. We have to get better at that on the DoD and the federal side, but that doesn't mean we should be so cavalier in thinking that we can do that better over time. No, it's got to be a partnership. Let commercial folks do what they do extremely well. We can contribute, vice versa. But again, I do think that it's an apples to oranges comparisons to say, well, you know, we do software better. Well, maybe not. But industry does those things incredibly well, and I think we should leverage that.
I agree, but I think the R&D part for the commercial companies to be doing it a lot quicker, faster, timing, I think comes down to it. The second thing I will say is human resources, finding the talent, paying a little bit different than DoD can, and then making that as we are experiencing it right now at Army Software Factory, keeping the soldiers around, right? Having that positions, given them if that is MOS or not, and so forth. What are we doing for the people that they stay around, so they do not get out and go back to the industry?
Yeah.
I do not think it's one of those things that they are doing better or so forth. End of the day, it's a people business.
Right.
And if we are not able to keep the people around in DoD and they're going into commercial markets, I think it's a cycle that we keep doing for the last.
Yeah. I mean, it is a cycle too, and I agree, right? Software Factory does a lot of great things here, developing soldiers that are learning coding, right?
Right.
But again, the Army has been doing software development for decades, right? They're all in different areas, and so there is a path, and I agree is cyclical, and so I think that's important. We got to enable back and forth. Government, industry, back to government, industry, and again, I don't think it's a binary thing, and we always think things are binary, but we need to enable that because we want some of our soldiers to go to industry, get better experience to come back in to help us, and vice versa, right? So I think you hit it on the head. It's got to be cyclical. There are great pockets, but again, it should be a partnership with industry.
Yeah, I would just reinforce that. I think the public-private partnership is really, really critical here. As a software company, our mission is to develop and deliver and maintain and sustain secure and agile software. And, for the most part, the DoD's mission is on warfighting. So we've really got to make sure that we continue these public-private efforts like we're doing here, which I think is a fantastic example of how we can do that cross-pollination and help each other, right? Because we're learning just as the folks here are learning as well.
Right. Okay, I look out at the audience, and my guess is that there's a number of you that are here that would like to pursue business either with the Army, or an education institution, or one of the big corporations. So my question then to y'all would be, what is the advice that you would give to the audience who are looking to do business with your organizations in the software field? Here's your pitch. Come on back.
Yeah, it's not a recruiting pitch, right? Well, the first thing I would say is, working in technology and supporting public sector customers, to me, has been, a passion. And I think it's really, really exciting to not only be able to learn technology, but to be able to learn and deliver technology for a mission as important as the DoD or the federal government or the intelligence community or even our state and local governments, right? So I would say, if you have an interest, pursue it. Learn, kind of where you want to be, where you want to go, and pursue that passion.
As I have seen both sides, small business side and working now in the Army as well in that capacities that I am doing right now. I think if you're a small business or medium-sized business that you're trying to get into working with DoD, number one advice will be patience because it's not going to happen overnight. Number two will be learning the customer. Army is different than Navy, Navy is different than Air Force, and so forth. And try to understand, having that understanding of what their requirements are, having those capability briefs, that requirements briefs, and so forth that every one of the services do, and having that information with you and then asking questions. A lot of networking, having those conversations. But in the end, it depends, first of all, is that if you're trying to get after the services model, how you can have those conversations, what exactly they're looking for, and be very laser focused, because there's a lot that you can do in the DoD market. And sometimes what I have seen, small to medium sized businesses, they are doing 14 different things and they're not laser focused on it. And it takes a lot longer time, and they are not working with one of the services, but they are working in 4 or 5. And having that timeline, there's frustration comes in, because the sales cycles are not 30 to 60 days. It can be 18 months plus. So that is one of those. My advice will be to be laser focused on what you're trying to do.
Yeah, mine will be slightly different, but because as an organization, we're the Army, but building on a couple of things that both Jennifer and Abdul have said is like, do your basic homework, right? There's so many vendors that come to me and be like, oh, I got a better mousetrap. I'm like, okay, you got a better mousetrap, so why do I care? There's certain things that y'all will do better from a business perspective, right? So we're trying to adopt those at the business enterprise level. But if you're selling me a better mousetrap, understand our mission. Understand our tactical mission, our warfighter mission, those type of things, and just don't think that some business system on the back end is going to work for us to do incredibly hard sensing, targeting, and firing of our exquisite weapon system, and just be naive to think, oh, just put everything into our stack, and we're going to automate everything. Okay, sounds great, but do a little bit of homework and understand our mission. And part of it is also, do the homework, but also hire some domain experts. There's tons of companies that come to me from a services standpoint. It's like, oh, we have this incredible Army team and blah, 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 blah. I'm like, well, how many of them were you even in the Army? And so I'm not saying you have to hire a whole army of Army folks, but bring in some folks so you understand our context and our missions, right? Again, enterprise business systems like payroll, and okay, a lot of those things we can adopt. But a lot of our exquisite weapon systems, our missions that we have to do, meet us in the middle, understand our mission, take your mousetrap and apply it to our mission to show exactly what you can do specifically for us versus just conceptual, right? And when you come to me conceptual, you want something. You want data, you want money to pilot something, great. What are we going to get in return? So I'll ask a lot of times like, well, so am I paying you guys for your own product development so you can actually wrap that and sell that back to me at a higher multiple? No, that's not very interesting for me, right? And so again, all I'm saying is just do some homework, do some due diligence, understand our mission, bring more domain people like Army folks into your organization so you understand our mission better.
Right. Okay, in the closing question, we are at South by Southwest, and so many times at South by Southwest, new things pop up. So I'm going to give each one of you an opportunity to tell me one thing, if you can, that we should be excited about your organization that's coming up in the near future. Or if you don't want to do that, you got a deep secret you can't share with anybody, even a hint about, then tell me, what is the takeaway you want everyone here to take today? Either one of those. You've got an option on this one.
Okay. Abdul wants to start. Go ahead. Okay.
I would say, as now I'm a part of the Army, so I would say the Army Software Factory, having that word out, understanding, of course, Marines news is a big news, joining here. And having that conversational piece of understanding what we are trying to do. So having people like Mr. Bang and others like DoD CDO being here, that really makes a huge difference because they can go and being our ambassadors back in DC. And understanding that this is not a one stop, we need to do a lot more, but this is still new in 2.5, 3 years, but how we can grow this. I think that's what will be my message, and everybody who's here today and will be here at South by, they can all help us, not just in the DoD market, but in the tech itself.
Great.
Yeah, I'd say I'll do the one takeaway. I think the big thing for me is just how powerful a partnership between a commercial company like VMware and the United States Army can be in terms of helping to impact the mission. That's the most exciting thing for me, and I'm really excited about what we're doing here and hoping that we can continue to grow and deliver for the DoD and the Army.
Yeah, I mean, I think ASALT, we have a lot of big plans. Those of you who already know me, we're working on things in the past year. We have some really big plans this year too, building on that success. There will be some things that are natural extensions and follow-ons. I'm sorry, I'm being a little obscure of what we did.
I gave you the permission to do that.
But there's going to be some big things that I'm going to push. And again, some of you know me, I like to really shoot and try to knock out those home runs. And even if I get a base hit or a double out of the home runs, right, we should be shooting for the home run. So we're going to go big, we're going to be ambitious. And I want to do that because one of the things that I think Abdul said earlier, right? Everyone knows the new old slogan we're rolling back out, be all you can be, right? We got a recruiting issue here in the Army because why? We have a bad branding perspective from industry or the high school kids or whatever. And I think we have the opportunity to drive transformation from a digital perspective, but more importantly, use that to accelerate our branding. Look at all the amazing stuff that people are doing in the Army. Software differently, right? AI differently. Autonomous drones and air-launched effects, all of the unmanned systems that we got going on, optionally manned fighting vehicles, all these cool things that kids that are playing video games all the time are shooting and doing, well, we're building those, right? And so I think it's a great opportunity. It's been a missed opportunity, but it's a great opportunity for us to really capitalize on the digital transformation we're doing, help with the branding with Be All You Can Be back in the Army, to get our recruiting out there, to get the better branding and perception of the industry, to say, hey, I'm doing these cool things, or I'm a high school student and I want to do software, or I want to do programming, or I want to do AI, or I want to do cyber, or I want to do robotics. You could do all that in the Army, and again, I think we need to really be pretty aggressive about pushing that brand out.
I love that. Thank you for a great pitch, and if y'all all join me in thanking the panel, then we're going to have Q&A, but let's thank them for a great job.
I think we have a question over here. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, I'm Mike Schwartz. Despite my casual attire, I'm the founder and CEO of Glue. We're a company, a software vendor based here in Austin that writes and leads an open source digital identity project. And in our last project with the Navy, the first team came in and deployed our software. They wrote some code. It was working amazing. And then about a year later, the leader of that project moved to a different area, and another team took over, and they had a lot of trouble sort of doing the handoff of that code. And one of our lessons learned was that maybe we don't need to write more code, but we really need to write a lot less code. And at Glue, we've really focused on building low-code tools. But we can wish for more retention, but we can also wish for world peace. It's just not going to happen. So we have to build in the fact that there's turnover is constant, and maybe what we need to do, I'm wondering, is actually minimize the amount of code and engage the business leaders in the design and whiteboarding process.
I love that because I always, on the commercial side, I almost made a business out of fixing people's code, right? Coming up behind people and sweeping it up and fixing it, scaling it, whatever, right? And I can't remember who I was having a discussion. I think it's great to teach people how to code. And philosophically, can you teach people logic? I don't know, maybe. But if I could, I would rather teach people logic and architecture versus coding, right? Because coding is syntax. You learn language, it's really syntax after that. But the logic is fundamental, right? And so like you said, do you write more code? Do we write less code? And we could get to that from a low-code, no-code perspective. But I'm like, Well, just because I do something and I have all these calls and reuse certain processes, does that mean my logic is better than someone else's? Maybe, maybe not. It's a little bit relative, and it's really just a matter of perspective, I think. But again, I think there's a dimension to that. And then with some of the languages now, right? Things that we used to write, 100,000 lines of code can really be, right? So absolutely, I think there's some value to that. And then your notion of low code, no code, I think that's a really good perspective. I think we should be moving more towards that. But we also know low code, no code, right? Whether some of these vendors that have that doesn't mean everyone can do that either, right? And then architecturally, how do we avoid vendor lock? There's dimensions of that we have to think through. But what we are trying to move, at least in the Army, is self-service, right? Whether underlying platforms or the ability to do SQL queries or Python queries for the user, right? So they don't actually need to call a data scientist from the hard problems that they're working to enable them to do basic things. That's where we're going. So we're moving towards a self-service. How we do that on the technical side, whether it's low code, no code, or other things, I think we have to really figure that out from our architectural perspective and guiding principles. But I resonate with a lot of what we said. I think we need to simplify things in general to include our architecture as well as how we're looking at logic in our code base.
That's great. I think we have time for one more question, and then we're going to wrap this up.
Hi, my name is Brian Kroger. Abdul, you mentioned that one of the big differences between industry and government is the decision making. I want to hone in on those decision makers, though. One thing that we're seeing in all of these software organizations that are popping up across the DoD is their C-suite, for lack of a better term, is turning over the entire C-suite on a 2-year basis. Or if you look at Kessel Run, it's actually less than that, 1.5 years. If you told somebody in industry that your stated strategy was to swap out your C-suite every 2 years, they'd think you're pretty crazy. Is this something that's on senior leadership's radar and is being prioritized? And if so, what are some of the things you think we could do to address it?
Very good question. I think Colonel Arico and a couple of others can explain to you more detail that we have worked very closely with the senior leadership about this model. When I was working with General Murray about this Army software factory, we have that a lot longer conversations about that exact thing. That you cannot have just people for 18 months and 24 months. The personalities changes, people changes, and so forth. And that's exactly what we are working very closely. I know Mr. Bang has been in conversations as well with the Undersecretary of the Army and others to make sure the leaders who are actually has been involved in this, that they can able to stay a little bit longer than the regular 2 years or 36 months. But I totally agree with you. This is a challenge. I personally do not think I'm also against the same person being there for 10 years as well. So there needs to be somewhat of a balance. But on the same side, again, it is Army, all right, or it is military, so there needs to be something in the middle that we need to compromise, but absolutely cannot be 18 months in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, you hit it on that. I think it's really, you hit a couple points, right? It's a cult of personality. Whether you have good leaders or bad leaders, right? The good thing about changing them out every couple of years is that that kind of leadership approach, whatever type of things happen. There is some goodness on longevity, but there's also some badness on that too. And so the way I look at it is you can drive individually and as an organization from a leadership perspective to change things. But once that leader leaves, the mark of that is how do they sustain that? And from my perspective, the inevitability of leaders changing, like look at me, I'm a political. I got a shelf life, right? Because I'm a political. But what I'm looking at is don't do the same process with the same people and expect a different outcome. And so what I'm trying to do is change some of the institutional processes. So when I'm gone, everyone here, they're still leaders, going to continue to be leaders, can still continue with that mission to evolve that. And if I am just looking at it myself as a cult of personality and just going to do this, this, and this, I don't think that's fair for the institution. So again, my whole thing, like I use as the Scrum Master, look at the enterprise obstacles. I'm going to try and knock those down and change some of the institutional processes so you all can be successful after I leave.
That's great. We actually do have one more question. I believe it's in the back. Go ahead, sir.
There it is. Vago Muradian with Defense and Aerospace Report. Glad to see all you guys. I've been here 36 hours, and almost everybody says the same thing they say back in Washington, which is, the department, whether it's the Army, no disrespect to anybody, doesn't understand how to buy software, right? Particularly software as a service, for example. Trey Stevens and Andrew got into hardware because he said the department doesn't know how to buy software. What are the measures you guys use to track progress, right? Like how you're moving that needle forward. I understand the diversity approach because, right, that's the definition of madness, because we're doing what we're doing because we do it and we don't get anywhere. What's the measure that you guys are actually moving the ball ahead and doing it at scale? A lot of very creative companies, but they do certain small select applications, whereas you guys, everything the Army does and everything DoD does is at an industrial scale. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I was having a philosophical discussion with Alan here about PMs, and a lot of times we default to hardware because that's what they know. And I say, well, at the end of the day, if you're an engineer, whether you're a software engineer or electrical engineer or a systems engineer, there's some basic foundational components of that that's fundamental, right? And some of that is that V, systems engineering V or engineering V, right? The traceability requirements back to the testing and everything else. And I was saying that same thing. Software, if you abstract it up one more level, is not very different from hardware in the context of engineering, right? So the metrics that you're talking about, we should apply similar type of thought process around metrics around hardware like we do for software, right? In the hardware side, we develop to painstaking detail some of the specs that we want vendors to build to. There's nothing different from that on the software perspective. We should be actually getting to the level of detail of interface specs, right? So that vendors can actually develop towards that. Those metrics aren't there. There is an analog, not everything, but most things from a hardware to software. I think we need to do a better job of tracking those type of metrics. There's the way that you do software a little bit different, right? Velocity, throughput, capacity. We are trying to create more of a knowledge base of that from a historical perspective, right? Because every Scrum team is different, right? But there are some bases that we can do, and we're trying to create those as a metrics perspective so we can kind of evolve to that. And then when you look at that, we're also looking at a more abstracted level, how we do from a palming perspective as it relates to software, right? So there is some software that we've been doing from an old waterfall approach that have taken marks after marks after marks because they haven't delivered or they're ahead of need. And so as we're pivoting, we're looking at that process holistically, say, we've re-baselined here at this point, we've shifted the requirements, we've shifted the acquisition approach, we've shifted the development approach, and now we're measuring process against that. So it's looking at a different baseline from where it used to be to kind of build our body of knowledge so we track metrics better. And so what I would say is, I think that's a great question that you pose. I think we're getting better at that. We're not there yet, but I think there's analogs that we've done on a hardware perspective that we just have to really interpolate back into the software side, and then again, create a better body of knowledge and metrics so we can actually articulate that to industry, and then more importantly to Congress, right? Because there are investors of how we're actually doing that better.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And the energy on this panel, the expertise, the diversity of thoughts, fantastic. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So